Something broke in my head, in my life. I guess it was inevitable. Fighting the entropy can only get you so far. Sooner or later, defenses just cave in. Can't stave off the real world if the real world keeps seeping through, leaks through every crack. I wish we could all be tiny again. Tiny and stupid. Picking berries and running away from tigers. Anything but this mess. I have to do that climate change assignment. I feel awful. Probably look awful. I'm gonna burn this room down. With me in it. Is this enough of an exhausted Gen Z vibe? I think it's enough of a vibe. Okay. Alright. Moving on. Being a young adult in 2021 is, well, it sure is an experience. Even before the thing that we're all still living through hit, me and many of my peers already had this feeling of impending world collapse lingering somewhere at the back of our minds. And it isn't an active sort of panic, it's not something that motivates you to suddenly turn into a prepper or rush into accomplishing as much as humanly possible before the inevitable end. Instead, it's a slow, simmering, almost a passive kind of anxiety that comes not from suddenly being thrown into an unstable situation, but instead from growing up in one, adapting to it from a very small age, and never knowing a different world. And it isn't an unreasonable teenager hyperbole either. I mean, China's emissions now exceed all the developed worlds combined. UN Secretary General, we stand on the edge of the abyss. A man-made disaster has created a manatee famine throughout Florida. New analysis finds global COVID death toll is double. We can't hold back rising oceans, we can only move out. Scientists fear more lung cancer as radon is released from ruling class plans to destabilize the country than profit from the Siberia is on fire and it's only May. Bill Gates says no to sharing vaccines formulas with global poor to end the pandemic. That's how it's always been, if you're under 25 years of age. We didn't have a promise of a better life taken away from us. We never received that promise in the first place. For me, this effect has been amplified even further by two factors. First, I grew up in Russia, and over the 18 years that I spent in the country, I saw it collapse from a struggling young democracy with still some limited hope of improvement into a totalitarian hellscape that I eventually fled. To Poland. Oh well, it was still a massive improvement. Second, I am a grad student of biology, and even though conservation biology is not my specialty at all, I'm constantly exposed to research on climate change and environmental damage. It is inescapable. I deal with fundamental questions of evolutionary genetics, but I simply cannot disregard these topics because of their influence on every ecological and evolutionary field. Also have compulsory classes about it. Multiple compulsory classes. Like, I'm on academic leave right now because of COVID, but I still have one class, and guess what my current assignment is? Yeah, it's climate change. Of course it's climate change. It's always climate change. Sometimes it just be like that. More often than sometimes. Of course, just the mere fact of all of this stuff happening is not the only influence on the youths of today. The other is the degree of exposure to it. And no, I'm not going to go all Herder, electricity is evil and Nikola Tesla was a witch on you, but we also have to acknowledge that no other generation in the history of Earth has been as informed about the current events and the state of the world as Gen Z. I'm not going to spit out generic arguments about pros and cons of social media or internet in general, like that's not what this is about, but let's just keep in mind that your average active internet user, and the vast majority of Gen Z are, will be exposed on any given day to an array of both world news and personal stories and accounts predominantly negative in nature. There's also Vine compilations, and instant regret clicking this playlist, and Crouton.net. So on balance, all of this leads to a few curious effects. Some are quite predictable, such as increased levels of negative mental health outcomes, high levels of stress, pessimistic outlook, and an increased focus on global issues and a sense of personal responsibility. Younger people are way more likely to not just have a strong opinion on politics, but to actively participate in various efforts like protests and demonstrations, for example. Basically, if you have good reason to be convinced that the world is on fire, you will in fact feel bad about it and feel pressured to do something about it. At the same time, there is this understanding that individual efforts can only go so far, and of how little influence and control we really have, both over the state of the world we inherited and even our own lives. Perhaps this is why Gen Z is flocking in large numbers to various forms of escapism, such as fandom, video games, and RPGs, and are enjoying and creating increasingly meaningless, abstract art and memes reminiscent of 20th century Dada. There's also just a smidge of Twitter hell and TikTok cults, but we'll come back to that. Other effects are more interesting, though. For example, despite being more connected than ever, Gen Z rate themselves as more lonely than the previous generations. We are also, and this was a relief to me, I have to admit, are dating and having sex less than any previous generation, including millennials, and are having these first experiences later in life. There are some intuitive guesses I have about this, such as the fact that dating apps are made in a way to keep you single, or the fact that relationships of any sort, including platonic, are increasingly commodified and devalued by the socio-economic system. But anyway, something a bit more specific and anecdotal that I've noticed in myself and in my peers is that a lot of us are, for some reason, convinced that we're not gonna make it past 30 years of age. I don't know how our brains imagine this, like I don't fear that I will literally drop dead the second I turn 30, but there is a lot of reluctance to plan anything more than a couple years into the future. I guess not a lot of us believe in any sort of certain future to begin with, like we grew up with so much rapid and drastic changes that it no longer feels like it is possible to predict or plan for anything that is more than like 5 years away. This doesn't mean that we are all out there partying and spending all of our parents' money. It's more just this feeling like you're never safe and secure and sure that whatever effort you're putting in now will bring any sort of reward in the future. So it's like YOLO, but with anxiety. Maybe it is in part because of a lot of standard life milestones that are either irrelevant or out of reach for us. Like, I am yet to meet a peer who has a cardboard cutout idea of life as get into uni, get a job, get married, buy a house, have 2.5 kids and work till retirement. We're interested in different things, and some, like having a stable job or buying a house, are pretty much impossible, so where's the motivation to work on anything long term? At the same time, an interesting thing emerges if you look at how Gen Z is trying to cope with all of this. Historically, in times of great instability and crisis, people would become more conservative and more religious. Makes sense. When people are afraid and stressed out, they cling to familiarity and try to seek support in systems and entities bigger than themselves. The latter has been true for the last year as well, as religious devotion went up during COVID. Meanwhile, Gen Z are going directly against this trend, as we are the most progressive and left-leaning and the least religious generation ever. We're also, and Jordan Peterson, please, if someone has found you and is forcing you to watch this somehow, cover your ears please, increasingly nihilistic in our philosophical views. So not only are we rejecting tradition and organized religion, it seems like we are rejecting meaning and purpose in general. Does this mean that we're completely, utterly fucked? I mean, it might, but I would argue that, if anything, this is the sign that young people are surprisingly resilient in the face of extreme adversity. Nihilism doesn't have to be bad. Have you seen the meme? You know, the meme, the Gen Z versus millennial meme? Yeah. I could just sit here for 30 more minutes and explore how nihilism can actually make you happier, or at the very least less miserable, but that's not how we do things over here. Oh no, we need some piece of media to take apart. And I know just the thing, the perfect, beautifully written, and quintessentially Gen Z story for it. Night in the Woods. Have you ever seen a cosplay so surprisingly high effort and yet so shitty? No, actually I'm kidding, I love it, and I don't care what anyone thinks. You'll just have to roll with us. Night in the Woods is a single-player adventure game released in 2017. It is an indie project created by a small group of writers and animators, and it began on Kickstarter, where it reached the initial funding goal in about a day and soon enough got to 400% of that initial budget. This money was not wasted. The game was highly rated on almost any list imaginable and received over 24 nominations and 5 Game Awards, mostly for its narrative and storytelling. The story is what appealed the most to me when I played it for the first time. Night in the Woods is more of an interactive novel, I guess, than a game in a traditional sense. Has plenty of interactive elements and minigames, but the core is still the narrative. The characters, their interactions, the dialogue, and the rich world building and the overall vibe that it has. And what vibe it has, my friends. It's not just about the cute 2D design and the anthropomorphic animals and the amazing soundtrack, it's the atmosphere of it. The protagonist of Night in the Woods is May, a 20-year-old who suddenly drops out of college and comes back to her hometown to live with her parents. From the very first couple of scenes, the player is introduced to the reality of Possum Springs, a town which used to survive thanks to coal mines and is now in a state of slow decay, both literal and figurative. Everywhere you go, you see abandoned buildings, shops and restaurants closing down, kids with no place to hang out, and adults with no place to work at. It is a fitting environment for May, who feels like her life and even her consciousness itself is gradually falling apart. The game at its core is about very human things. It's about being young and mentally ill, it's about Rust Belt America and economic stagnation and the effects of late-stage capitalism, and it's about human connections and how we deal with all that complexity and pain. It touches on a lot of topics that I brought up at the beginning of this video, like the anxiety that instability produces and the general sense of helplessness and hopelessness that a lot of young people are living in now. May feels lost in life. She wanders through the streets of Possum Springs, seemingly with no aim or purpose in mind, and finds herself drifting further and further away from reality. All of her friends are working, either because they are saving up to escape the town, like Greg and Angus, or because they have no other choice, like Bear. Everyone in the town is working. except maybe for the homeless man she befriends and the kids that she hangs out with. Work, meaningless, exhausting, tedious work, is inescapable. The decay and dissociation is inescapable. That's the world she lives in. I think this is a major reason this game appealed so deeply to me and many of my peers. Mental illness, bullshit jobs, a general sense of despair at the state of the world, these are all very common Gen Z experiences. And there's so many beautifully crafted world-building elements in this game, from the tiny snippets of news that you can get when checking online messages, to the bits of mildly depressing comedy you can watch with May's dad, that enforce this very feeling. The atmosphere of Night in the Woods is perhaps a certain artistic exaggeration, but it seems fitting through a lens of a young person's mind. That is how I feel sometimes, in kind of rigid, black and white tones. At the same time, the game itself is far from endlessly depressing. It occupies this peculiar corner in between despair and comfort. It's in the gameplay and the narrative, the slow progression of events that makes you focus on the small things, the slice of life scenes and dialogue, and my meandering exploration of the world. The plot is basically non-existent for the first quarter of the game, and there's a general sense of comfortable aimlessness, maybe even a slight apathy in it all. The enjoyment in this slow-paced exploration is all in the brilliant writing and the atmosphere. It almost feels like a bit of a Studio Ghibli vibe to me, in the sense that it celebrates the mundane and makes very casual and seemingly pointless dialogues really interesting. The people and the places of Possum Springs are interesting enough to get lost in the game, just going from day to day, getting to know the characters and finding new spots to visit. And you might start to believe that this is all there is to this game, to life, the connections and meanderings, like it's a more witty and character-driven kind of Animal Crossing. And then something happens. And the game is transformed from a slice-of-life sandbox to a dark, convoluted mystery. The game's inciting incident and major turning point come quite late into the narrative and take the player through a progression of various genres. It all starts with May and her friends finding a severed arm just laying on the street, I guess, which they don't seem to be particularly alarmed by. Very on brand for a town like that. They inspect the arm, mostly through poking it with a stick, at which point you might think, okay, so there's gonna be a murder mystery in this too. And there sort of is, but it's really much bigger and much weirder than a simple detective plot. Soon after the severed arm incident, May witnesses a strange cloaked figure kidnapping a child, and suddenly we're into the paranormal territory since she is convinced that the kidnapper is a ghost. And then she starts seeing bizarre musical dreams and feeling the ghost's presence everywhere she goes, and as the investigation unfolds, the line between reality and May's anxieties in dissociative episodes begins to blur. All of this happens as the character arcs continue to develop, mind you. We're still visiting various characters and exploring Possum Springs and learning about the very real, grounded problems and conflicts that these characters are dealing with. Except now there's a contrast. There's a world of mundane dark on one side and another increasingly bizarre kind of dark on the other, intertwined and coexisting. And by the time May is having her dream encounter with the mysterious entity that she identifies as God, I'd argue we're firmly into the territory of cosmic horror. Cosmic horror is a peculiar subgenre. For one, it was invented almost in its entirety by one person by the name of H.P. Lovecraft, whom I will not talk about because he was a big-time racist and overall not a nice person. I also haven't read his books, to be honest, so my familiarity with the original cosmic horror stories is limited to their retelling in Doctor Who Big Finish. I never said I have proper media criticism credentials, okay? I'm an evolutionary biologist. Cosmic horror is also strangely named, because neither the term or the alternative Lovecraftian fiction tells you much about what defines it. Cosmic makes people think of space and aliens, and Lovecraft makes people think of tentacle monsters, and neither of those are essential to these stories. Cosmic, in this context, means the scale. It means something so vast and complex it is almost beyond our comprehension and understanding. Cosmic as in we're a tiny grain of sand in a possibly endless universe that doesn't give a fuck about us. Cosmic as in I'm helpless, I'm powerless. Horror as in the strongest fear of all, fear of the unknown. Really, this subgenre has more in common with mythology and religious texts than it does with science fiction. My personal cosmic horror faves, Cabin in the Woods and The Last Door, don't even have anything to do with space or aliens. Instead, they draw from religious themes and focus on that hollow, chilling feel of insignificance in the face of an all-powerful, unknowable something. That's the kind of cosmic horror that Night in the Woods explores in both of its narrative lines. On one hand, there is a pretty obvious cosmic horror reading of the mystery plot, the strange dreams that May is having, the evil presence that she feels, and, at the end of the game, the big reveal of the bizarre cult that has been operating in Possum Springs for quite some time. The game is pretty vague on what was real as far as the narrative is concerned and what is entirely imagined or hallucinated, but that very much fits the ambiguity and unease characteristic of cosmic horror. On the other hand, there is a slightly more metaphorical cosmic horror reading of the grounded slice-of-life plot, and the two are not entirely separate. It makes sense, for me at least, if you think about it. I mean, if cosmic horror is about the things we cannot control but have control over us, it doesn't have to be a physical, material being. The threat can be a concept. Mental illness, circumstance and chance, job insecurity, the economy itself.
The struggling economy is forcing people to take some major risks with their health.
Last night we told you about people putting off dentist appointments to save money. Tonight we learned people are also not going to the doctor, and small illnesses are turning into big ones.
Doctors say they are putting off going to the doctor because they don't want to shell out that cash to pay for the copay or prescriptions.
We can't shut in the economy. The economic cost to individuals is just too great.
Let's go to work. Our country wasn't built to be shut down. This is not a country that was built for this. It was not built to be shut down. We cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. We're not going to let the cure be worse than the problem.
To ensure that we support not just businesses but also individuals and their families to keep our economy going.
For my 20s, from 15 to 30, I didn't go anywhere on the weekends. Nowhere. Who did that? Who worked 18 hours a day for fucking 15 years like I did? Don't know me.
Sure.
I fucking worked every minute of my life.
Sure, but there's people out there, Gary, that don't necessarily subscribe to that, right? That
They're
don't
gonna lose.
necessarily think
They're gonna lose.
that's not the way.
I don't give a fuck about them. They're gonna lose.
Our economy may be done at this point, he said. Over, dead, not coming back.
Hell is coming. This was a feeling like I've never had. Like there's a tsunami coming, right? The tsunami's coming in. You feel it in the air. We need to shut it down now. America will end as we know it, okay? I'm sorry to say so, okay, unless we take this option.
I'm sure I'm not the only one that have noticed this, especially since the start of the pandemic. So many people, experts and laymen alike, tend to talk about the economy as if it was some sort of pagan god. I can't imagine people in ancient Greece, which was at the time one of the most developed cultures in the world in terms of scientific and political thought, talking like this about how the crops are failing because Persephone isn't happy. It's actually scary to me how much the economy talk mirrors pagan narratives or religious narratives in general. Like, at the very beginning of the pandemic, when there were heated debates about whether to prioritize economic productivity or human lives and safety, a lot of people on the side of the economy were talking literal human sacrifice.
No one reached out to me and said, as a senior citizen, are you willing to take a chance on your survival in exchange for keeping the America that all America loves for your children and grandchildren? And if that's the exchange, I'm all in.
That's what? This is what happens in Night in the Woods as well, where the Possum Springs Black Goat cult literally sacrifices people they deem useless and unproductive by chucking them down into a hole at the abandoned coal mine in the hopes that it will bring jobs to town somehow. There are other interesting examples and parallels in the game, such as the local Pastor K trying desperately to persuade the local council to let homeless people stay at the church, and ultimately failing. It would be easy to dismiss this sort of quasi-religious thinking as either ignorant or outright evil, which, trust me, the human sacrifice part really does make me angry, but I'm not going to dismiss it out of hand. In part because I would be a hypocrite if I demanded 100% rational, materialistic response out of every person in every situation. But more about that later. For now, let's take another drastic turn in this essay, fuck knows what it is about anyway, and talk about how humans generally deal with the cosmic horror of being a tiny grain in a vast, uncaring universe. Being an animal is tough. You have a lot of cells and tissues and your metabolism is quite high, which often forces you to move around a lot to find enough food to sustain yourself. Your isolation from the environment is not ideal, no matter how well you fit it, so you often have to seek shelter or protect yourself through other means. And you're most likely sexually reproducing, which is fun, but also means you have to find a partner willing to reproduce with you, maybe demonstrate to them that you're good enough, fight off competition, or build a home and raise babies together. Also, a lot of things want to eat you, probably, so you have to escape from those as well. One of the key traits that distinguishes animals from other living things is a nervous system. Not all animals have one, and there's a wide spectrum of complexity between basic sensory cells of a jellyfish and the brain of a dolphin, but it is a uniquely animal trait. Having a nervous system is great, because it allows you to gather and process a lot of sensory information and then react to it. You can move quickly in a specific direction, escape predators, locate potential mating partners, and, if your brain is suited for it, do more complicated things. Make decisions, solve problems, notice and identify patterns. The question of what makes humans different from other animals has generated an enormous amount of debate over the years, and I'm not going to answer it here. Pattern-seeking ability is a trait commonly brought up as one of the defining human features. Many other animals can notice patterns too, but no one else has perfected it to the degree that we have. Humans have astonishing information processing powers. We are so good at identifying and classifying objects that even the supercomputers we've built, that can easily beat the world's best chess and Go players, still struggle to tell apart pictures of naked humans from pictures of sand dunes. That's what a capture is, by the way. A computer can calculate millions of operations per second, but no, it cannot pick out every picture that has a bicycle in it. Pattern seeking and systematization is quite likely what allowed us to build civilizations. It's the reason we tamed fire, figured out how to domesticate other animals and cultivate plants, invented increasingly complex tools, and developed social systems that allowed us to cooperate in numbers that would make even ants envious. Humans are, first and foremost, pattern seekers and storytellers. More on that in Yuval Harari's Sapiens, if you're curious. Thing is though, this trait is so developed in us, it became almost hypertrophied. Hyperactive agency detection refers to our tendency to overassume active intervention, even when there is none. At a basic level, it goes like this. You see something moving, and it isn't moving through inertia, like a rock tumbling down a hill or a leaf picked up by wind. You can't identify the object. It could be an active agent, or it could be a weirdly moving rock or a tree branch. Out of these two options, you always assume an active agent, or rather your subconscious brain does, since this happens faster than your consciousness can process really anything. Your automatic processing is biased towards agency, hence hyperactive agency detection. This is a useful shortcut, since it is always safer to assume agency even when there is none. If the shrub is moving from a strange gust of wind and you assume a tiger, the cost is negligent. You've just been spooked by a shrub. Happens to everyone. You burned a couple calories worrying your mates might laugh at you a bit. You move on with your survival and reproduction. But if the shrub is moving because there is a tiger in it and you assume strange wind, well, you get eaten. And your genes don't get passed on because you've just got eaten. So it's always safer to err on the side of tiger. On a more complex level though, this hyperactive agency detection can extend to much bigger phenomena. Why is the spring so rainy this year when it's always been hot and sunny before? Why are these mushrooms growing in a neat circle around the tree even though all other mushrooms you've seen grow in messy clumps? Why did your child die in infancy, even though you've cared for them the best that you could? These questions don't have to be so scientific and existential, and the pattern seeking can be quite mundane. Humans and other animals to a lesser extent have a tendency to form connections between two things that happen sequentially. For example, you eat a berry and you get sick, the berry made you sick. You sacrifice a goat to the weather gods and suddenly the spring is hot and sunny again. Weather can be fixed by sacrifice. And yes, correlation doesn't equal causation, but our subconscious brains don't know that. They just connect the dots. Superstitious behavior seems to be universal enough that you can train it into a pigeon, and simple rituals that seem quasi-religious in nature have been observed in several non-human animals, including corvids and great apes. It is not a great leap of the imagination when you know about our agency detection and pattern-seeking abilities to figure out how religions form. Human brains can process vast amounts of information, yes, perhaps more than any other living thing, and naturally enough, we feel lost in that sea of information. It baffles us, it scares us, the whole scope of sensory data and knowledge is simply too vast to be comprehended. So we try to make the best sense of it as we can, and often that includes seeing the biggest patterns, spirits, miracles, magic, and deities, in that ocean of facts and patterns and experiences. As one study puts it, the cultural phenomena typically labeled as religion may be understood as the product of aggregated ordinary cognition. Basically, some sort of spiritual or religious thinking is natural to us. It is a logical progression of our unique cognitive skill set. Historically, spiritual and religious beliefs have cycled through certain stages. The oldest of religions known is animism, the belief that nature is full of conscious entities, spirits, that have control over various aspects of our environment. The next stage is supernatural or metaphysical concepts, such as the concept of a soul or an afterlife. Spirits can also become personified, which is how we get pantheons of pagan deities, all with their own personalities and values. Arguably, the final stage of this process is monotheistic religions like Christianity or Islam. However, it's worth pointing out that 1, we still have 2 major religions today that either have a pantheon, like Hinduism, or don't have gods as such to begin with, like Buddhism, and 2, modern Christianity, for example, is not strictly monotheistic either, since it has apostles and saints and all kinds of sort of godlike characters. Actually, you can argue that an even further progression was secularization, a move away from sincere religious belief altogether, but really none of it is linear. It's all messy and convoluted like any other human thing, and today in the world we have all kinds of religious belief anywhere on the spectrum from animism to strict monotheism. What is interesting to me is how humans seem to be incapable of existing without some sort of religious or spiritual system, even if it isn't really a religion as much as a core narrative, partly based on philosophy, for example, and partly built in metaphor. Really, there is now plenty of people who are either atheists or agnostics, or religious only in a cultural sense, and still very much have this story-like structures in their brains, through which they understand and interpret the world. And yes, by the way, I do very much include myself in that, and I think it's probably universal, to some extent at least, but we'll come back to my own views later, if you're curious. Anyway, I've just spent a very long time rambling and saying a lot of smart-sounding words, so let's roll this back to what I've talked about previously. So, does anyone else think that the neoliberal worldview has cycled all the way back to some sort of pagan cult in some select few people? Or is it just me?
The struggling economy is forcing people to take some major risks with their health.
We can't shut in the economy.
To keep our economy going.
For my 20s, from 15 to 30, I didn't go anywhere on the weekends. Nowhere.
There are lots of grandparents out there in this country, like me, I have 6 grandchildren, that what we all care about and what we love more than anything are those children. I don't want the whole country to be sacrificed.
America will end as we know it. I'm sorry to say so. Okay, unless we take this option.
Like, come on, how easy would it be to replace the word economy in there with some sort of eldritch abomination? It's really not a huge leap of the imagination to go from this to this. Neoliberalism, as an ideology at its core, is hyper-focused on free will, responsibility of the individual, and importance of freedom above all other ideals. And it can feel empowering in theory, but in reality, individual action can only take you so far, and at some point you will in fact bump into a whole bunch of obstacles you have no control over, such as prejudice, wealth inequality, not enough luck, your personal limitations, the entire economic system, to be honest. But if your ideology tells you that you always have the power to achieve anything you set your mind to, well, inevitably you start to wonder, is there something wrong with me? Like, am I weak or stupid? Am I worthless? At the same time, with all of its focus on individuals, neoliberalism seems to be obsessed with purely constructed metaphorical entities like the free market and money and growth and the economy itself. And it constantly empathizes how these entities and systems must not be disrupted. There must not be infringement on any individual rights, no messing with the market, no stopping the growth, no, r/Wall Street bets handle stock market speculation, even though that's literally what the stock market is, because
that hurt the money. The money didn't like that.
And we can't have that now, can we? You get the gist. And it is kind of accurate, I guess. I mean, these systems that we've created, they really are bigger than any of us at this point, and even the economists aren't sure whether we can, like, control them. And not just any person, like, even the billionaires. Like, it really does scare me how we've invented these things, like money, and then sort of let them out, and now they exist kind of independently of us, and it's not really clear whether we can stuff that shit back into its Pandora box. All of this not to say that liberals are uniquely stupid or superstitious or whatever. I think they're neither stupid or superstitious, actually. Misguided or misinformed in some ways? Yeah, maybe. But this sort of way of thinking in narratives is very natural and very human, and people of all views and ages do it. I've said that Gen Z are leaving organized religion en masse, and it's true, but it doesn't really mean that religious and spiritual thinking just got entirely yeeted out of our brains. Oh no, Gen Z are flocking to all kinds of spiritual ideas, from neo-paganism and Wicca to big philosophical worldviews and New Age religions. And some are very much doing it to extreme. Like, there are literal cults happening on TikTok, and there are other less obviously religious groups like MLMs and pyramid schemes that do kind of mimic these cult-like mentalities. Also, I don't want to sound anti-SJW, but the way that teenagers used to act on Tumblr and are acting on Twitter now, big yikes. Maybe teenagers just have a huge weak spot for falling into cults, I don't fucking know. And New Age is very diverse and eclectic in views, so it's hard to talk about it as one solid thing, but it has its own problems too, from just good old pseudoscience to issues of the more political kind. The latter is brilliantly outlined in this video by Culture Kaleidoscope. Basically, humans just be reinventing religion over and over again. And I don't even think it's a bad thing, to be honest. On one hand, I am an atheist, a materialist, and a scientific skeptic. I don't believe in the afterlife, universal morality, or the soul, or even free will. And I'm honestly pretty comfortable thinking that life is fundamentally meaningless and there is not really any reason any of us were born. It doesn't upset me or make me feel hopeless. I wouldn't say I'm a nihilist exactly. I think hedonist is probably a better descriptor, but also valuing well-being and thinking that it is important to reduce pain and suffering doesn't mean I think that pleasure is our divinely assigned purpose. We seek pleasure and avoid pain because we're animals, because we evolved with a nervous system. Fundamentally, it's still all meaningless. On the other hand, and boy, that was a long hand stretch. I also read tarot and practice simple witchcraft and can tell you what I have as my sun, moon and rising. It's Sagittarius, Aries and Capricorn, by the way. Yeah, I know, lethal. Is this a huge contradiction? Am I in terrible cognitive dissonance? Not really. Like, do I actually believe that tarot can tell me something I don't know already, or that my full moon rituals have any material influence on my life? No, I don't. I also don't think that the position of stars at the time of my birth has any real significance for my personality. I'm a Sagittarius and we're all skeptical like that. I'm kidding, I'm sorry, this joke was too good to not be used. But yeah, I don't think astrology or magic or divination is actually physically real. I also don't think that something has to be real to be enjoyed. Like, I think it's enough for something to be a good, compelling story. I'm a writer. I have and always have had a very vivid, borderline hallucinative imagination. Stories matter a great deal to me, and I don't need them to be real in order to be incredibly important and meaningful. Like, I have a perfect understanding that Doctor Who is a work of fiction with no connection to reality whatsoever, and it's still a huge influence on my taste in fiction, on my identity, even my philosophical beliefs. I still have the Doctor's Academy nickname tattooed here in my skin. The era of enlightenment, or more specifically the invention of the scientific method, was one of the best things that happened to humanity. I'm not going to dispute that. Like, we fucked up so many things as a species, including a lot of things during the Enlightenment itself. So much colonialism and bigotry and oppression, people. But the scientific method bit, good, excellent, a massive help. Human brains are terrible at trying to at least approach an accurate understanding of objective reality. If objective reality even exists as a thing, I very much doubt we can ever understand it, because we didn't evolve to be objective, okay, we evolved to survive and reproduce. The scientific method helps. It deals with a lot of the shortcuts in our thinking and allows us to tell apart real patterns from imagined patterns. And that's how you get electricity and antibiotics and the internet that has Vine compilations and Crouton.net, remember? So yeah, scientific method, materialism, good, leads to massive increases in well-being. Also leads to technology that might destroy us on the planet with it, but anyway. What I mean is, I do think there is a huge value in at least attempting to be rational and objective in most areas of life. But, and I can't believe I'm saying this, I kinda agree with Jordan Peterson, as in I do think there is a problem of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I just don't think the baby should be baby Jesus. I do feel though that we're losing a lot as a species when we declare that the only things that are objective, real and measurable have any value. Like, I don't understand the contradiction between the two, really. I don't get why we can't acknowledge that something can be both fictional and incredibly important. I don't have to literally believe in magic to read tarot and practice moon rituals, much like I don't have to believe that the Doctor is a real person to find an enormous amount of comfort and meaning in stories about them. Also, we have plenty of people who are religious only in a cultural sense these days. Secular Jews, non-practicing Christians, people who grew up religious and don't believe anymore but still go to church and follow some of the teachings, people who have never been Christian in the first place but celebrate Christmas and Easter. It is possible to separate genuine devoted belief from cultural and traditional practices. And I think that's wonderful. Like, I think it's the way forward. I think we can keep the baby, so to speak, keep the benefits of a natural inclination toward religious and spiritual thinking without sacrificing our rationality or unified understanding of the physical reality. You might think it's a contradiction again, but there is a curious fact for you. You know placebos? The phenomenon of a medication or a treatment of any sort being effective despite not having any sort of chemical or physiological component. Well, the curious thing is, placebos work even if you know it's a placebo. Yeah, I know, it sounds insane, but it is true. It has been demonstrated many times with many different conditions and types of placebos. You can straight up tell someone, this is a sugar pill, it doesn't do anything to you, but take it anyway and tell me if you feel better. And it works. It isn't clear why it happens. A part of it might be the good old Pavlovian conditioning, as in we have a built-in understanding as adults that pills usually make you feel better. There's a ritualistic effect in it, like just the act of taking a pill activates natural pain relief, for example. Or it might be the fact that treatment, even with sugar pills, involves human contact and attention, and sometimes is really all you need to feel at least a little bit better. It's fascinating in any case, and I think there's a clear parallel to religion as well. There is another interesting fact, which is that, according to some researchers at least, in the historical development of religion, evolution of ritual supersedes evolution of narratives and beliefs. As in, you develop an association between certain hand movements or words and a desired outcome first, and only then you come up with, often subconsciously, a story that explains it. It kind of parallels the idea that reasoning actually works backwards, as in you make up your mind first and develop reasons for it later. More on that in the video by our Lord and Savior Michael Vsauce. And again, this might sound bananas to you, but thing is, ritual is probably the most important part of a religious system, because it's kind of a social grooming. Grooming as in the thing that all primates do to each other to maintain relationships. We're a weird sort of monkey and we live in much bigger groups, so we don't have time to pick insects from each other's fur anymore. Instead we do other things. We gossip, we laugh together, and we practice religious or spiritual rituals. As another paper puts it, convergent development across social scientific disciplines provide evidence that ritual is a physiologically prepared, culturally inherited behavioral trademark of our species. Basically, religious rituals are a distinctly human trait, and it evolved to keep our groups stable, to provide comfort, unity, and a sense of belonging. So knowing all of this, my question is, do we really need some sort of overarching narrative with specific answers to stay sane and keep societies together? Or is it enough to just share stories and rituals? Can we really be sane and be happy while being atheists, skeptics, and nihilists? So, do you have this thing where someone asks you what your favorite book is, and your brain suddenly goes, I have not read a book in my entire life and I am completely illiterate, actually, leave me alone to die. Because I have that, but with trying to explain what my favorite stories are about. Like, every time someone asks me what Doctor Who is about, I go, well, it's about, actually you just have to watch it, because it's impossible to explain what it is without sounding utterly insane. I just generally have a problem with summarizing, really. I think it's an autistic thing, with the whole not being able to see the bigger picture trait. So when it comes to Night in the Woods as well, I really struggle to describe why this game is so special to me, or explain its plots and themes. Hope I did a good enough job in this video. I think, the best I can put it, I think Night in the Woods is fundamentally about confronting the things we cannot control and how we choose to cope and survive and act in the face of cosmic indifference. And there isn't one correct answer or one right solution presented in the game, beyond the obvious, I guess, of sacrificing people to some sort of ancient god / concept of economic stability. Bad. But really, the entire resolution of the plot leaves a lot of things unsaid, and the story itself kind of has an open ending. It does present some potential solutions for surviving the horrors, like the connections we build and maintain, for example, but it doesn't assert any sort of definitive morality. The game doesn't even have a happy ending. It concludes in a more positive note than it began, with May slowly starting to recover and reconnect with her friends and family. However, nothing is really fixed by the final scene. Possum Springs is still falling apart, May is still struggling with mental health, Angus and Greg are still planning to leave, Bay is still working herself to the bone, and Casey is still dead. I've read and watched a bunch of reviews of this game for the preparation for this video, and for a lot of people, the ambiguity and the lack of a definitive happy ending is what kind of ruined the experience for them. I can understand where they're coming from, but this was not my experience. Well, I mean, I am rather biased because I love both open endings and unhappy endings in fiction, but also I can't imagine this game concluding in any different way. It wouldn't be true to itself if it tried to magically fix any of the problems it highlighted. Instead, it offers a perspective of something that is not perfect, and maybe not even always effective, but is real enough to be profoundly comforting. The same way that there is warmth and comfort in the aimless and often bleak exploration of Possum Springs, there is a sense of contentment in the story's largely meaningless conclusion. It isn't exactly happy, but it is hopeful. That, I think, is the real essence of optimistic nihilism. Weirdly enough, I think it draws inspiration from its philosophical adversary, existentialism, namely in the concept of thoroughness. Thoroughness as in, hey, neither of us chose to be here and the world is kind of fucked up, and to make it worse, all of us are going to die, and most likely not in a way and at a time of our choosing. The answer that existentialism has to this crisis is to discover or invent your own meaning, and stick to it. The answer that optimistic nihilism can give you is, well, to admit that there is no meaning, but it isn't as bad as you think it is. Really, if you consider this for a moment, no meaning or no ultimate purpose means that you cannot fail at life. It means that sometimes no one is to blame for your or other people's misfortune, so you don't have to keep beating yourself up for not being perfect. That you are free to change your mind about what to do with your life at any moment, and that the only thing that truly matters is our presence, our experiences, the time we have, and what we choose to do with it at every moment. One scene from Night in the Woods captures this feeling perfectly for me, and it contains a sentence that I consider one of my favorite lines of fiction of all times. It's the scene in which May and Angus are watching the stars together and talk a bit about religion and spiritual belief, and Angus says, in response to the question of what he thinks about the world, "So I believe in a universe that doesn't care and people who do." That's how I feel too. I don't believe in gods or any sort of universal consciousness. I don't think the universe has a plan or a destiny for me, and I don't feel like things always happen for a reason. Really, I think there's just us, living things with nervous systems in an unimaginably huge world that doesn't really give a fuck about us. And I'm pretty okay with that. I was raised without any sort of religious tradition, and my biggest influence from very early childhood was my grandfather, who was an atheist, a communist, and had a PhD in quantum physics. The two things that he always tried to cultivate in me were compassion and curiosity, and I hope, that he succeeded. I was brought up on an enormous amount of books, movies, games, what have you, on fiction and science and biographies, exposed to a vast amount of human creativity and knowledge, and that's where I draw my comfort. From human connections, from stories, from communities. When my grandfather died last year from COVID, I wondered whether I would naturally reach for some sort of idea of an afterlife, even though I've never believed in it, and I knew that he did not believe in it either. And I discovered that no, not really. It was enough to remember, to have memories and stories, and to cherish them. And that's what optimistic nihilism is to me. It's being comfortable with lack of meaning and lack of answers, and living in a little bit of a continuous existential crisis, but drawing hope and comfort in aimlessness, lack of pressure, and from other humans, other sentient beings in general, and the things, the stories, for example, that we create. And I honestly, genuinely believe that it's enough. People are enough. We don't need a god if we have each other. We're enough. So, conclusions. That thing that I've just said, I'm really bad at. Okay, well, in the spirit of showing off my tattoos, because I already showed you the first one, the Theta Sigma one, this is the other one. I can't really see it, I'm gonna have a photo of it on the screen. I have 2 so far. I want way more, but I'm trying to space them out, like to give every version of me in every year his own share of skin, I guess. So this is the second law of thermodynamics, which states that in a closed system, entropy always increases. I did actually have quite a few people, including the artist who was doing the tattoo, ask me what it means, and as usual I struggle to put it into words. I mean, the very basic meaning of this is that we're all gonna die. That's the memento mori part, a reminder to stay mindful, to enjoy the present moment while I still have it. But another meaning of it is more complicated. So there's this strange argument for the existence of God, or for intelligent design or whatever, that states, quite wrongly, that the existence of life breaks the second law of thermodynamics. Because, you know, entropy isn't chaos, things becoming more uniform, more homogenized, spread out, basically like mushification of matter. Entropy always has to increase. But what living things do is exactly the opposite of that. We decrease entropy and make matter less mushy and more ordered, and supposedly shit can't work like that. Well, it can, because living things are not closed systems. In a closed system, yes, entropy always increases, but kind of like the entire thing of life is that we take energy out of the universe and use it to order ourselves. That's how we stay alive, by taking an energy. But it also means that we are speeding up the entropy buildup of the entire universe. We're bringing the heat death of the universe closer. By a tiny margin, mind you, like a really very tiny margin. But yeah, it's a thing. Basically, life, any form of life, is just, it's amazing. It's so fundamentally, mind-bogglingly amazing that I can totally understand how one would leap to the conclusion that we're just impossible. But we exist at a cost to the environment, to the ecosystems that we inhabit, and ultimately at the cost of the entire universe. So while I don't believe in any sort of God or universal consciousness, I do think we have a responsibility. Responsibility to be kind to one another, at the very least to the people who extend or have extended that kindness to us. Responsibility to not fuck up the planet, perhaps, if not for anyone else, then at least for our own future. Responsibility to ourselves, too, to try where we can to be curious and compassionate and kind. Yeah, I think it always just comes back to that. We don't owe anyone or anyone meaning, but I do believe that we owe ourselves and each other kindness. And that's a good enough purpose to focus on, even if it's ultimately meaningless. Hey, so if you're still watching this video, which will probably be like an hour long again, thank you so much for sticking to the end. I'm still figuring this thing out, I'm still working with horrible tech, my laptop just cracked open again, but we're rolling with it, I'm trying, I'm figuring this shit out. So I wanted to say here at the end of the video, first, that the citations and the references for this video will not be in the description because it's getting kind of long and getting out of hand. It will be in a separate Google Docs, and the link will be in the description, so you can go there and sort of look through them and see what every article and every source is about. I also wanted to say, that this video had a $20 budget, which I know sounds ridiculous, but $20 in Poland is like a decent amount of money, and it's enough to eat for a few days, you know. And I'm perpetually broke, and I'm not saying this to kind of elicit any sort of pity or whatever. Like, I've spent this money because I wanted to make this, not really making this for anyone. I'm just like figuring shit out and trying to be creative. But I did want to say that I have a Ko-fi page, and the link is in the description as well. It is by no means an obligation, but I'm just saying, like, if you like this and if you took some, I don't know, information, comfort, entertainment, whatever from this, you can tip me, you can like compensate this ridiculous budget of $20 that I've spent on this. And honestly, if, like, again, this is absolutely not an obligation, and if you like my videos and you want to support this channel, honestly, like, the best way that you can do this is, one, interact with it. So like, subscribe, comment, all of the usual YouTuber stuff, and you can also just share these videos with other people on social media, just like over messages, just like tell other people about it, because at the end of the day, that's still the most effective way in which videos spread on small channels like that grow. So that's basically it. Thank you again for watching. It really means a lot to me. I love making these videos, and I don't really think about anyone watching them, but if you have, like, great, thank you. Thank you a lot. And yeah, that's it. Thank you, and spend the rest of your life being ridiculously kind to yourself and everyone else.